Good morning, Year 12. This is going to be the final new knowledge lesson for Theme 1E, Christianity and the Kerygma. So we have already looked at the themes of the Kerygma using CH Dodd. We've discussed whether the Kerygma has an over-reliance or presents the first Christians as being part of some kind of apocalyptic group and whether that is relevant for today. We have looked at claims about how historically reliable the Kerygma is, and we're going to finish by looking at Bultmann on the Kerygma. So as always, we're going to start with a starter quiz where you're going to be retrieving knowledge from previous lessons or previous units that's going to be relevant for today. So if we put the title, How Does Bultmann Challenge the Kerygmata? I have used this word, my lovelies, because this is just plural for Kerygma. It's a plural for proclamations, giving away the answer to a question there. But it's on the spec, and so you could have a question that uses the word Kerygmata, and I don't want anybody sat there for ages tapping their fingers going, I don't know what that word means. It's just plural of Kerygma. So put the title, How Does Bultmann Challenge the Kerygmata? Answer the 5 questions, put me on pause. I'm going to have a cup of tea while you do that, and then press play, and I'll be back to you with the answers. So let's run through the answers, and I'm going to give you little bits of information as we do that that's going to help you link with today's lesson. So Bultmann is writing in the 20th century. He was actually born at the end of the 19th century in 1884. Literature students know that I'm rubbish with dates. I did Google that before I started recording this video. So he's writing in the 20th century. That is really important because in the sort of 18th, 19th century, there is a quest for the historical Jesus. So lots of biblical scholars are analysing the stories of Jesus in the New Testament, trying to work out who is this historical figure of Jesus, trying to build a biography of him. Bultmann wants to end that, and so he wants to draw a line under the quest for the historical Jesus, and instead he says, no, what we are doing is we are reaching the Jesus of faith, and that Jesus of faith is not anchored in a moment in history. He offers timeless truths. So we need to remove away any attempt of a historical context, because that makes him irrelevant for today. But also we can't get back to the historical person, and we need to strip away any mythology or supernatural. So the fact he's writing in the 20th century is important. Remember, we say to you in your essays that where you can, use your knowledge of a scholar's place in history and life experiences to unpack their ideas further. That's something that could push your essay up. Number 2. We all know Ender has got this one right. What school of thought do we associate with Bultmann and its Christian existentialism? Don't forget, my lovelies, that one of the descriptors for growing up in one of the top bands in an essay is referring to schools of thought. So place Bultmann against his background of Christian existentialism. What does Bultmann say a modern audience needs to do to the resurrection stories? They need demythologizing. What does the word Kerygma mean? As I gave away, it means proclamation. So we are reading the proclamations of the first Christians about Jesus. We're not reading a historical account of Jesus's life, or even a historical account of the life of the first Christians. We're reading theological documents. What were Bultmann's religious beliefs? He was a Christian. Now I know, my lovelies, that none of you listening are going to do this, but you sometimes read answers from students who've crammed some revision the night before. They've read 3 lines about Bultmann in a revision guide, and all that they've taken on board is that Bultmann wants to get rid of miracles, and so he hates Christianity, he wants to get rid of Christianity. He so doesn't. He wants to make Christianity relevant for a modern audience so they can access these timeless truths. So Bultmann was a Christian in Germany. That makes him quite interesting. He was a member of the Confessing Church. And go and do a bit of reading. We're on lockdown, we've all got loads of time. Do a bit of reading about Bultmann, the Confessing Church, their responses to what is happening in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, Bultmann's views on the anti-Semitism within Germany in the 1930s and 40s. All really, really interesting. And remember, the more you read about a scholar, often it helps you understand their ideas. So now let's zone in a little more on Bultmann. And so this is a quote lots of students remember bits of or paraphrase, and there's nothing wrong in that. Please do not, however, spend loads of mental energy trying to memorise a long quote word from word. Also, don't write essays where you just write out loads of quotes, but you never say what the quote means and how it links to the question at hand. But this is Bultmann. We cannot use electric lights and radios and the event of illness avail ourselves of the modern medical and clinical means at the same time and believe in the spirit and wonder of the New Testament. So Bultmann says that we are of a modern world view. When we get to theme 1F, we're going to return to this idea of world views, but we are part of the post-Enlightenment, rational, scientific, empirical world view. And so there's always going to be a clash between our worldview and that of the first Christians living in the 1st century. Sorry, you probably heard, as you know, I live at home with my little boy, and he's just come in and said, "Mummy, will you play hide and seek?" And I've had to say, "Mummy can't play hide and seek. She's talking about Rudolf Bultmann with year 12. He really doesn't care, and he's now sulking. Anyway, back to this. Bultmann says that there is a clash between the worldview of Christians today, or people who might become Christians today, and the 1st century Palestine. And if we allow those stories, the stories of the Bible or the Christian message, to become so attached to that 1st century worldview, it's going to have no appeal for a modern audience. And Bultmann thinks that Christianity offers timeless truths that the modern audience needs. And you can imagine him, you know, in Germany, 1930s, 1940s, even beyond that, thinking we're in a world that really needs Christianity. We really need to make it work for us. We really need to make it speak for us. So what I want you to do now is I want you to go and look up the 2 speeches of Peter in Acts 2, 14 to 39. That's the one we've looked at in more detail. That's following the events of Pentecost, and Acts 3, 12 to 26. They're both on the spec. I'm going to be honest with you. I think if you know the one in Acts 2, that should be enough for an essay. But because the one in Acts 3 is on the spec, I want us to have some kind of familiarity with it. So I want you to highlight on the speeches where you can see the mythological elements, the spirit and wonder of the New Testament world. By that he means 1st century Palestine at the time of Jesus and the early church. For an example, to get you started, that little bit where it talks about the moon going blood red and the sun going dark, that is supernatural kind of language, especially when you attribute that to God. making it happen. If you haven't got a printout of these speeches, and you probably don't want to highlight an actual Bible, either Google these Bible references or go to Bible Gateway and type them in and use the NIV translation. When you go to Bible Gateway, you can pick your translation. Make sure you're not reading something like the Message. That's had too many changes to it. You want something like the NIV, New International Version rather. So if I leave you to do that, so go to the speeches, you can do it on screen and highlight with your electronic highlighter, you know, the highlighter at the top of Word, or you can print it out and do it the old-fashioned way. This will give you lots of examples to use in an essay where you're saying this is the mythological stuff, the supernatural stuff in the speeches that Bultmann says we need to remove or move past. Put me on pause while you do that. Another challenge that Bultmann has to the Kerygma, I've spelt Kerygmata wrong up there, it should be YG. Another challenge that Bultmann has to the Kerygma is that we need to be aware of the influences on that piece of writing that might not be immediately obvious and don't exist today. And if we're going to make those speeches relevant to Christians today, if there's an influence that is no longer relevant, we need to move beyond that. And a key influence, according to Bultmann, are the ideas of the Gnostics. Now, Bultmann thinks that there are Gnostic ideas that are influential on the New Testament and on these speeches in Acts, and also on the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark and Luke, and also on John, very much so on John. There is some disagreement on whether Gnostic ideas were so prevalent in the 1st century that they would have an influence on the very earliest writings in the New Testament. But Bultmann says that they were. The Gnostics they weren't really a cohesive group of people. It's more a collection of ideas that were held by people within Jewish and Christian communities in the 1st and 2nd century. And those ideas were seen as heretical. And much of the Council of Nicaea, which of course is 4th century, much of the work of that council is addressing these Gnostic ideas that by that time have taken a bit more of a hold. How influential they were in the 1st century, as I said, is up for debate. The Gnostics are really, really interesting. You've got lots of time on your hands. Go away and do some research about Gnostic ideas. Utterly fascinating. And if you enjoy Plato is hugely influential on Gnostic ideas. I'm a real Plato fan, and so I find Gnosticism fascinating. This is going to be a real whistle-stop tour of Gnostic ideas. First of all, they have a real emphasis on secret knowledge. That's where you can see the influence of people like Plato, but also Pythagoras. And this secret knowledge is the key to salvation. And in addition, the Gnostics buy into this idea of dualism, as does Plato, if you remember rightly. And dualism is the idea that there are two substances in the world. There's the material or the physical and the metaphysical. Meta just means beyond, so beyond the physical, the spiritual. And dualism, as expressed by Gnosticism and people like Plato, says that the physical world is inferior. It's even evil. And we need to have a focus on the spiritual. And one Gnostic idea, and as I said, they're not cohesive ideas, there's disagreement, is that there was a fallen God or a demiurge that created the world, because how could a perfect God create a fallen physical world? And then a good God. And some Gnostics saw Jesus as being sent by the good God for some kind of cosmic battle to defeat the creator God of the Old Testament. And many Gnostics also rejected the idea that Jesus, God, could have been a human. How could that happen when physical is bad? Now, this idea of some kind of apocalyptic battle between good and evil, you can see in New Testament writings. Remember, we looked at the little apocalypse from Mark, and there was that idea perhaps of some kind of cosmic battle. Lots of scholars, including Bultmann, would say, ha, that's the influence of Gnosticism. But we're particularly interested in those speeches. We're interested in those speeches in Acts rather than the Gospels as a whole. And remember, Bultmann says that you can see clear Gnostic influences. The whole idea that humans are sinful, we're fallen, and we need saving in Christianity, Bultmann would say that's a Gnostic influence. And if you think about C.H. Dodd's themes that he identifies in the speeches in Acts, and in addition, remember, in the writings of Paul, there's this idea that people are in the wrong, we've gone on the wrong path, we need to repent and be baptised. That idea from Gnosticism that there is secret knowledge that provides salvation. If you look at the story of Pentecost, you have got a spirit, something from the spirit world, enabling the disciples to receive and share sacred knowledge that will bring about salvation. Bultmann says one of the challenges of modern Christians dealing with the Kerygma is that they are not just looking at the ideas of the neutral ideas of Jesus or Peter and Paul. You're looking at the influence on Gnosticism on the early church who put these speeches together, and you need to be aware of that. That's a challenge to the reader. And also, it's not just that Gnosticism influences the ideas in the speeches, but perhaps the speeches are used or manipulated by the early church to address Gnostic heresies. So if you remember in Acts 2, there's that whole section where we are reminded that Jesus was sent by God, that Jesus was a man who was crucified by those wicked men and then rose from the dead. And that's another theme identified by C.H. Dodd. Maybe that emphasis in the speeches is addressing Gnostic heresies. Maybe that's why they're in there. Today, the Christian church is not overrun by Gnostic heresies. And so maybe those influences are a distraction from the message of Jesus that we don't need. There was a lot on the previous slide, and so you might want to pause and play it over again as you do your notes. The next and final challenge is that we need to be aware that, as I said at the beginning in the quiz, that we just can't get to the historical Jesus. Remember I said to you that in the 18th and 19th century, lots of biblical scholars, that's what they were trying to do. They were almost trying to piece together a biography of who Jesus was, what his life was like, what he actually said. But Bultmann says that when we look at the Gospels in particular, we just have a mixture of fragments of stories that have all been through multiple filters of the early church. We have these legendary stories that need demythologizing. There's just too much to work through to accurately access the Jesus of history. It's a fruitless quest. And remember that C.H. Dodd does think that those speeches in Acts have historical value. They can tell us about the historical Jesus and the history of people like Peter and Paul. And Bultmann just rejects that. It's another challenge when you're reading those speeches. Now, this is the final bit on Bultmann. And it's important to acknowledge that although Bultmann says that there are challenges in reading the Kerygma, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value, and a very able student will make that point. Bultmann was a form critic, one of the first and most important form critics. Remember, I've told you before that lots of the scholarly work done about the Bible in the 19th, 20th century was coming from Germany. Bultmann was German, and he's linked with a form of biblical criticism called form criticism. And form criticism is basically analysing texts and asking what form of writing, what style of writing am I looking at, and that's going to help you understand the text. So Bultmann, for example, identifies evidence of myths or legends in the Bible. He identifies parables, stories that are not historically true, they're stories with teaching points. And Bultmann says it's important that you know what style of writing you're looking at so that you understand it properly. And Bultmann says that when he looks at the synoptic gospels, by the synoptic gospels we mean Matthew, Mark and Luke, we are not looking at historical records of the life of Jesus. We're looking at a record of what the early church believed about Jesus. The setting in life is important. That's a nice link with redaction criticism that you looked at when we looked at the birth stories. And Bultmann says when we look at the stories of Jesus, we can make claims about him. So we can say, for example, that he was baptized by John the Baptist, that he was put to death by Pontius Pilate. But at its core, that Bultmann says, Jesus was an existentialist teacher of timeless truths. And that poses a challenge to modern Christians to make a decision about how they are going to respond to the story, to the message of Jesus. And in Acts 2, so that's the first speech from Peter, there's a line that when the people of Jerusalem, the Jewish people of Jerusalem, are listening to the disciples talk, this happens. It's in the green bubble here. When the people heard this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the other apostles, "Brothers, what shall we do?" And Bultmann says this message of Jesus should cut us to the heart. It should produce a strong emotional response. And we have the challenge as modern Christians of how are we going to respond to that message. So just as the original audience were asking themselves, what shall we do now? Bultmann says Christians should be asking themselves the same. This is at the heart of what it is to be a Christian. And therefore those proclamations, the Kerygma, has huge significant value, because they are prompting us to say, what are we going to do in response to the message of Jesus? That is the value. The value isn't in viewing it as a historical document. You are reading theological claims about Jesus, and now you have to make your own theological claims. You have to deal with the Jesus of faith, not the Jesus of history. There is a line in the spec that talks about the Kerygma and adapting the Christian message to suit the audience. This is at heart a Bultmann question. So to summarise what we have been through, when the modern audience is going to adapt the message of the Kerygma to suit them, Bultmann says they're going to do the following. They're going to reject the myth, the wonder, the supernatural. They're going to remove the Gnostic influence. And just like in Act 2, they're going to be cut to the heart, and they're going to ask themselves, what am I going to do as a response? You can see that if this was a part A, you rarely have time to do more than 3 paragraphs, and they are your 3 paragraphs. If the question was, explain how Christians today adapt the message of the Kerygma for them. That's not worded very well. Let's try again. Explain how Christians could adapt the message of the Kerygma to make it relevant for today. That's better. And they would be your 3 paragraphs. You might want to pause and make your own version of that diagram. So I'm aware there was a lot there. I have sent Litchit students, and this is also on our YouTube channel that anybody can access, and I'll put a link to this video because this isn't going to be clickable in the box below the video. So this is an essay that I have written under timed conditions that explain Bultmann's challenges to the Kerygma. It's 20 marks. I've highlighted the key skills. Remember, when I type in 20 minutes, I produce more than you can write, but it means that then everybody has got something that they can take away. But it's done under exam conditions. It should get a grade A star, or I'm in the wrong job, but it's not going to be perfect. But the examiners are not after perfect, they're after the response of an intelligent, educated 18-year-old, and the two are a little bit different. So what I want Litchit students to do is I want you to reduce my essay down to a plan. So you're basically reducing each paragraph down to 1 or 2 points. Make yourself a word bank as well. What are the key words that I have used? Next lesson, we're going to do an activity drawing all of Kerygma together and getting ready for a multi-choice test on Kerygma, Bultmann and CH Dodd, and then we're going to move back to some ethics. Thank you, Year 12.